serious crimes, and that conspiracy, these three conspiracies, allow him to go from A to Z. All of the things happening even before the election, when he started laying the groundwork about how vote by mail might be rife for fraud, and all the way after the election, January 6th and beyond, even to this day, where he is saying things about, that the election was stolen. So this strikes me as very sound charging decisions, and I look forward to reading the details.
Before we get into some of the details, Andrew, you pointed out something that you and Neil were talking about specifically, and I'll get Neil's reaction to this as well, but you were very curious to know who the judge was going to be. We do now have a name of the judge. What can you tell us about who he is?
Who she is.
I apologize, who she is. I misread.
So, Tanya Sue Chutkan. So the bench in D.C. is very strong, and no one stronger than Judge Chutkan. So this is an extremely good draw. It should be an extremely good draw for either side, because she is a really solid and very well-respected jurist. She started on the bench in D.C. in 2014. She was nominated by President Obama, and is just, I think, widely respected. And I also think it's hard for anyone to ever be prepared for a case of this magnitude, but I think that this is one that is, going to be well within her skill set and experience. This is not somebody who's new to the federal bench and new to dealing with these issues. That has been the sort of knock on Aileen Cannon. That's not the case with Judge Chutkan.
One of the more important things that we are learning in this 45-page indictment, and to our viewers, we're doing this in real time on the air, as you can imagine. We now have 6 co-defendants that were in this indictment. I'm just going to list very quickly who they are. We don't know specifically their names, but we do know their positions that they've occupied. Co-conspirator 1, an attorney who is willing to spread knowingly false claims and pursue strategies that the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign attorneys would not. Co-conspirator 2, an attorney who devised and attempted to implement a strategy to leverage the vice president's ceremonial role overseeing the certification process. Co-conspirator 3, an attorney who unfounded claims of election fraud the defendant privately acknowledged to others sounded crazy. Co-conspirator 4, a Justice Department official who worked on civil matters and who, with the defendant, attempted to use the Justice Department to open sham election crime investigations. Co-conspirator number 5, an attorney who assisted in devising and attempting to implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceedings. Co-conspirator number 6, a political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification. Pretty significant, because it gives us an insight that they were operating on the 2 different crimes that we were talking about: an attempt to impede the congressional proceedings, but also the conspiracy to provide fake electors.
Absolutely, and if they didn't name people. That is Justice Department policy, unless you're charged.
Well, we can infer.
Absolutely. This is one where it's not hard to infer. So Jeffrey Clark is clearly called out when they talk about a prior DOJ official who's a civil person who started promoting.
A Justice Department official who worked on civil matters and who, with the defendant, attempted to use the Justice Department to open sham election crime investigations and influence state legislators with knowingly false claims of election fraud. You were referring that to be...
That is Jeffrey Clark. Sidney Powell is another person. John Eastman is one. I think Rudy Giuliani may be another. Obviously, we have to look at this more closely, but that seems to be who they are describing. The thing to watch for is whether there are additional charges against them.
All right, stay with me for a second. Let's cross over to Ken Delaney at the Department of Justice with more information. Ken.
Eamon, I think what you just read is a very significant aspect of this indictment that we didn't necessarily see coming. The January 6th committee had a whole hearing about this, arguably one of the most compelling days, with former senior Justice Department officials testifying about this scheme to use the Justice Department and this letter that was drafted by Jeffrey Clark, a lower level official of the Justice Department, that he wanted the Justice Department to send out. I believe there was one to Georgia, but there were others to other states, saying, we, the Justice Department, have found fraud and we have significant concerns about fraud, and we think you should call your legislature into special session. Many observers said, had that letter actually gone out on Justice Department letterhead, the consequences would have been almost unimaginable, because as it is, millions of people believe Donald Trump that there was fraud in the election. Had the Justice Department officially endorsed that claim, it would have been a disaster. But instead, Trump appointees inside the DOJ stopped it. But now the Justice Department, as part of this indictment, is alleging that that was part of the criminal conspiracy. I also think it's noteworthy, there's an entire section in here laying out the reasons why Donald Trump knew that he lost the election. A lot of this is known and it's been reported on, but that he was briefed by senior officials in his government, including the Director of National Intelligence and his former Attorney General and others, very clearly that he had lost the election. And that's important because they have to prove that in order to make this case. They have to prove that this was a fraud, a knowing fraud by Donald Trump, and they say that they can do that in this indictment.
So Ari Melber is with me here. Ari, let me just, something that jumped out to me, and I'm kind of working this document in real time, but we've talked a lot about the mindset of Donald Trump and how important that was going to be to understand whether he knew what he was doing was in the furtherance of a crime. And now we have it here in the indictment. These claims, according to the indictment, these claims about the elections, the claims were false. The defendant knew that they were false. In fact, the defendant was notified repeatedly that his claims were untrue, often by the people on whom he relied for candid advice on important matters and who were best positioned to know the facts. And he deliberately disregarded the truth. And then it goes on to list examples of him disregarding that truth.
Yeah, that's a core of this brand new indictment that we've just gotten, because the lies here are actually crimes, according to Jack Smith. That language, defraud the U.S., means that you're knowingly perpetuating a fraud. This is something we've been waiting on. I'm just going to hold it up here for our newsroom cameras. We talk about a speaking indictment. This is something more like a shouting indictment.
Yeah.
This is incredibly detailed. We've been making our way through it. I've read part of it. It is incredibly broad, specific, and damning. The number of states involved are far broader than you would need. We're seeing basically a multi-state conspiracy allegation, what they call the 6, quote, contested states. We're seeing basically 3 conspiracies Jack Smith charges Donald Trump with. You've alluded to these in your reporting, and I just want to read from it. We have 3 of them laid out at one point where he says, with some detail, the conspiracy to defraud the U.S. was using fraud to impair and obstruct the lawful federal government function to process a presidential election. Conspiracy 2, to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding. That's, of course, the day that they stormed the Capitol for that proceeding. And then C, a conspiracy against the right to vote and have one's vote counted in violation of federal law. And so this is very specific. We've heard a lot of spin and minimizing and lies, outright lies, about what happened in and around January 6th. This is now going to be tested in court. The new indictment of Donald Trump here is Jack Smith saying there were these 3 conspiracies that are charged. As for those 6 co-conspirators, my view, and our analysts will weigh in, but I think this is a broader set of co-conspirators than many were expecting. There was talk about what my colleague just mentioned, that there was a DOJ official, Mr. Clark. There was Mr. Eastman, a very controversial lawyer who was pushing things that he himself admitted in writing were probably unlawful. But this is 6 individuals. We have the 4 attorneys, the DOJ official, and then co-conspirator 6, a political consultant who implemented a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors. And the reason why this is also really significant as a very strong indictment here is we're looking at a lot of different lanes. Jack Smith has to have the evidence to prove all of them, but he's also going to be presenting to a jury, if this goes to trial, many different crimes, 3 different conspiracies. And so if you win some, not all of those, you still have then a conviction. And so, Andrew, I would bring you in on that. And the vice president part is the one more thing I wanted to flag and get your legal analysis on, as we're all kind of doing this in real time. This looks like new information to me. I'm reading from page 33, and again, we're just going through this.
You're a fast reader.
On December 25th, Vice President called the defendant, the former president, Donald Trump, listed as the defendant. So this is Christmas Day, obviously. Called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas. Reading from the new indictment, the defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th. So this is, of course, about 2 weeks out. It says, quote, the vice president pushed back, telling the defendant, as he had before, quote, "You know, I don't have the authority to change the outcome." And then this very damning narrative continues December 29th, January 1st, January 3rd. I'm not going to read all of them, but it basically is outlining as criminal evidence, and this has never happened before today, as criminal evidence what the then outgoing president, Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, was doing and saying to officials in government, including his number two, the vice president, is criminal evidence of a conspiracy to defraud the United States. The pushback to this, and the defendant's presumed innocent, it would be, well, doesn't the president have broad authority to make inquiries, requests, and even issue orders to his subordinates? And here what we're seeing, and Andrew, weigh in if you like, is an argument by Jack Smith that was actually crossing over from governing to abusing the power of the United States government to defraud and commit a crime against the U.S.
Well, let's remember that every government official, most of all the President of the United States, whoever holds that office, takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. And Eric, to your point, if you look at paragraph 90B on page 33, you have the allegation clearly coming from the Vice President of the United States, who, remember, went into the grand jury and testified something he didn't provide information to the January 6th committee, and said that the President of the United States told him falsely that the, quote, Justice Department was finding major infractions. And we know that's not true. We know that from Bill Barr. We know that from Jeffrey Rosen. We know that from Rich Donahue. We know that Jeff Clark was willing to say, I am going to say that, which is what the former president wanted. Just say it, even though it wasn't true. So this is definitely a major new allegation. I just wanted to comment for a moment on what some viewers may have as a question, which is, you referenced that there are these 6 co-conspirators who are not named but are clearly sort of identified, and people are going to be quickly putting together who they are. And somebody might ask, well, why are they not charged in this?
Or why not named? Yeah.
Exactly. Well, not named is because they aren't charged. Okay. So that's just a DOJ policy, which is basically put up or shut up. If you charge somebody, you can name them. If you're not charging them, you can't name them. So that's why you have things like in the Mar-a-Lago case saying employee 1, employee 2, attorney 1, attorney 2. So here it's by description, but not by name. But if you look at the cover page, it is just United States versus Donald J. Trump. This to me shows that Jack Smith wants to get to trial, and he wants to get to trial quickly. Those other people may be charged in a separate case. He clearly is saying that they are guilty. But the reason that you don't see 7 defendants is if you want to get to trial, you bring something narrow and focused against the defendant who you need to try before the general election. So if I were those 6 people, I would not be sleeping well tonight, but I don't think that we should anticipate they're going to be included here, because this shows a singular focus for Jack Smith on speed.
Neil Cattell is with us. Neil, we're working our way through this 45-page indictment, and just at a glance, you can see that it's multi-state. I've seen already talking about crimes or attempt to further the crime in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and Michigan, and Georgia. That there's a reference to the infamous Georgia phone call that the defendant made to Brett Raffensperger on December 8th, in which he instructed him to basically find 11,000 plus votes. The level of detail in this is astonishing, and specifically as it relates to January 6th, several pages, almost a minute-by-minute account of what happened on January 6th between the defendant, the communication that he was having, and the co-conspirators around the violence of January the 6th.
Yeah, Ari described this as a screaming indictment, and he's absolutely right. I mean, the level of detail here is so astounding, it's going to take us a long time to go through it all. But I think that Eamon, what you're reading about the different states reflects really Jack Smith's major decision. His tactical decision here was to use the conspiracy doctrine. And the most important thing about the conspiracy doctrine, I actually spent several years writing academic articles about it. The most important thing about it is that it applies to what are called inchoate crimes. That is, you don't have to be successful. Like, you and I can agree to rob a bank. That itself is a crime, even if we don't ultimately rob the bank. So here, Donald Trump could have agreed with others, these 6 others, to try and prevent the official count from happening, doesn't have to actually prevent the count from happening. It's a crime by itself to make that kind of agreement and to further overt acts in furtherance of that agreement. So that's why I think you see so much emphasis on these different states and all the different attempts Donald Trump and his minions had to overturn the popular vote in this election. The other thing about the conspiracy doctrine, and this goes to Andrew's point about the 6 other the 6 other people who are unnamed here, I agree with Andrew. I read this as Jack Smith saying, my target here for now is Trump, and I want nothing to slow me down. Like, for example, when we did the prosecution of George Floyd in Minnesota, of which I was a part, there were 4 defendants. We're very worried that if, Derek Chauvin obviously committing took the most direct action, but we felt very strongly that the others played an integral part, so we charged them all together. That does run the risk of slowing down a criminal trial. Here, Jack Smith took the view, I'm going to indict one for now being the key words, because the other part of the conspiracy doctrine, most important other part about it, is that it is used to try and flip defendants, to say to someone, hey, look, you're facing massive criminal exposure here. Come and testify against those who ordered you and conspired with you to do this, and you can avoid serious sanctions. And I suspect that's part of what the prosecutors are thinking about here as well. The last thing I just want to point out is Judge Chutkan in D.C. I've had experience with her, many others today have. Very, very respected judge. Doesn't play politics left or right. And one really important thing is she served as a public defender for many, many years. That's her training and background. So she will bring a criminal defense lawyer's perspective to this case. Yes, she's appointed by Obama, and I suspect we'll hear Donald Trump talking about that. But this is a very, very good draw for both sides, a fair-minded judge who understands criminal defendants' rights.
You bring up 2 very interesting points. I'm going to get to them. We had a feed of the Department of Justice, the newsroom, and you can start seeing some reporters getting in there. We are expecting a statement from the special counsel, Jack Smith. We're certainly going to bring that to you live when it gets underway. We don't have a time yet as to when that is going to happen, but if the past was any indication, it will probably be a short statement, but nonetheless, we will have that for you. Neil, to your point about the Judge Tanya S. Chutkan, our correspondent Ryan Riley points out that, according to the court docket, she was a D.C. federal judge who had sentenced many January 6 defendants to the sentences longer than what the government had asked for. Your thoughts on that?
I think that's true of many judges in D.C. Remember, almost every judge has January 6 cases, maybe every single judge, because they have overwhelmed that courthouse. And sure, I think most judges have sometimes gone up and sometimes gone down on the government's request. I don't think that on sentencing, I don't think that itself tells us much. This is a person who has a really long track record of, listening to prosecutors, listening to defense attorneys, but not someone like the old kind of style of federal judge, former prosecutor who tends to listen to other prosecutors. That's not her reputation at all here. And so I think Jack Smith is going to have to be cautious here and not push the envelope, because she will have none of it.
Hey, Andrew, can I ask you about this? You talked about the first page of the indictment. There are 4 counts that are listed here. 2 of them are conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, but different codes next to them. Can you explain what those differences might be from those 2 codes? I mean, count 1 is conspiracy to defraud the United States. Count 2, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. Count 3 is also an obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. And then count 4 is conspiracy against rights.
Sure. So if you look at paragraph 4, there are different conspiracies that are alleged. And so the conspiracy where it's to obstruct the governmental functions, that triggers a violation of a certain statute, 371. You have another which is an obstruction of Congress. That's a separate statute, which is 1512. So they sound alike,
right,
but very often what you do is you look at a set of facts, and then you look at the congressional code that makes things crimes, and you figure out which crime best fits that set of facts. And often a single set of facts triggers different crimes. It also is a way to deal with uncertainty in the law. With respect to the obstruction charge under 1512, there is a pending case and there is a pending issue with respect to the scope of the 1512 statute. I mean, it's a lot of really nerdy law stuff, but one of the ways that if you're Jack Smith, you bring a conservative indictment is thinking of ways to charge this in with different statutes. The 371 conspiracy, that is bread and butter. That has been charged time immemorial. And so that is very, very hard to think how you'd have a legal challenge to that. And so this is a way of making this very rock solid.
Joining me here on set now is Msnbc legal analyst Lisa Rubin. Lisa, you've had now a few minutes longer than us to go through the legal document.
Must be an expert by now.
Yeah, I was going to say, compared to us, you are the expert here now on this. What are your big takeaways from what you've been able to read so far?
Well, Eamon, one of the things that jumps out at me is, in addition to these 6 co-conspirators that are identified, some of whom we can take pretty educated guesses as to who they are, there's a mention of Mark Meadows, at least in paragraph 55 and throughout the indictment, referring to him as the defendant's chief of staff. And his not being in that list of co-conspirators, I think is particularly interesting, certainly based on Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony before the January 6th committee. You might expect Mark Meadows to be included among those co-conspirators. Certainly here, for example, in paragraph 55, they talk about Mark Meadows emailing and sharing a memo written by Ken Chesbrough as to how to execute the fake electors plot to others on the campaign. So it's not as if he's not involved in this constellation of facts.
And who's Chesbrough, just so everyone knows?
Ken Chesbrough is an attorney. I believe that he is co-conspirator 5 here. He's a lawyer that worked originally with Trump campaign lawyers in Wisconsin, but he's the legal mastermind behind the fake electors plot. And in particular, he drafted the documents that took each group of fake electors through how to implement the scheme. Essentially, like, here's what you need to do. I am going to send you step-by-step instructions for doing this, because none of these people understood how to be fake electors in the way that the Trump campaign and Trump's allies wanted them to be, were it not for Ken Chesbrough first seeding the groundwork for the legal theory and then showing them how to do it.
A moment to thank all of our guests who have helped us try and make sense of this monumental and historic indictment against the former president of the United States for an attempt to overturn a U.S. election. Our thanks to everyone. The Beat with Ari Melber continues. Those first comments from Special Counsel Jack Smith, we're expecting those in just a few minutes. Ari?
Eamon, good to be with you on this breaking news day. Thank you very much for your coverage. Welcome to The Beat, everyone. I'm Ari Melber, and as discussed, we are awaiting Jack Smith, who will speak here on the breaking news of Donald Trump indicted in the election probe. Special Counsel Jack Smith has charged Donald Trump now on 4 counts: conspiracy to defraud the U.S., conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and a conspiracy against rights. Those are 4 different crimes that Donald Trump has now been indicted on. This is a huge and significant development. As we've mentioned in our breaking coverage, if you've heard about legal issues with Donald Trump before, if you've heard about him even being indicted before, this is the largest and most significant federal indictment of Donald Trump ever. This is, in ways that we will document, more significant even than the serious legal headaches he already has. This is also, to be clear, tonight, the first time any former president has been indicted by the federal Justice Department for trying to steal an election. Now, I mentioned, if you've been watching our breaking coverage here, we've been going through what is a voluminous filing, that this is in some ways broader than people expected. Indeed, while a conspiracy only requires 1 or more other people, Jack Smith has found 6 other co-conspirators that are named in the filing. It alleges that Trump spread lies that there had been outcome-determinative fraud, meaning fraud that would actually have swung the election back to him, and that he had actually won. These claims were false, and Trump knew they were false. I want to put up on the screen what we are watching for. We'll take this in full. I want to share with everyone exactly what we're learning. This has been a day where we have been trying to hew closely to what we know and don't know. We've only learned in the past several moments, kind of the most last-minute heads-up you'll ever get from a government agency, in this case the Justice Department, that Jack Smith will approach the podium you see here, and some of the local beat reporters have now assembled in that room, that he will approach that podium any moment, we're told, at 6:01 p.m. in Washington, and speak on this new indictment. If he does do so, and of course you can see the preparations for that. It will be only the second time we have ever heard from Jack Smith publicly. The first was in the original indictment of Donald Trump in the classified documents, an espionage case. So when we get anything out of that room, clues or the special counsel himself, we will bring it to you live here on The Beat. This is a breaking news night, so I want to start to bring in our experts. I have David Kelly, the former SDNY chief and my former boss, and a former SDNY prosecutor, Christy Greenberg, and our set of experts will be expanding over time. David, you've sat here in our newsroom and we've talked about this eventuality. Tonight it becomes reality. When you look at this case, when you look at the 4 counts, 3 conspiracies, and to be clear with people, that means above and beyond and separate from the violence on January 6th and what happened in those hours on January 6th. These are other longer range conspiracies, some that run weeks, if not months. What kind of indictment is this? Do you view it as narrow or broad, as kind of precisely nitpicking, or looking at a wider set of election plots?
I'll say a couple of things. One is I think it's a masterpiece. A masterpiece in the sense that it lays out very concisely what the charges are and what acts support the indictment. And I think that it's also a masterpiece in transparency for those very same reasons, which I think are incredibly important, that there's a whole group of folks out there that think this is a hoax. And these are facts that can't really be contested, haven't really been contested, and they really jump out. It's called a speaking indictment. I heard somebody earlier call it a screaming indictment.
I said shouting indictment.
But
because it's so loud.
It is, and it's loud, but there's an elegance to it and a grace to it because of how well it's composed and how it's just jammed with facts that are going to be very difficult for the defendant to dispute, and it's going to be very difficult for that large portion of the American populace to think that this is a hoax, and this is just a testament to the fact that facts matter.
Yeah. And that fraud is one of the charges. I mentioned Christy Greenberg is here, so is Andrew Weissman, who's one of the many experts who's been waiting on this. Here we are. Andrew, you and I spoke about it earlier on Breaking Coverage. David just pointed out that this is the area where lies become criminal. I want to ask you something I haven't had a chance to discuss with you yet, which is that Jack Smith goes out of his way in this indictment, as I read it, to say the defendant may lie in public. The defendant may zealously advocate for his criticisms of the election, and yet he went farther than that. Why does Smith say that? Some people might be surprised that it's okay to lie in the eyes of the DOJ. And why does he say that something worse happened here, something criminal?
So I think that's really smart to make it really clear to people reading this what is lawful and allowed under the First Amendment. It's clearly saying just because you say something that's not true, that's not what you're being charged with. That may be a crime if you are lying to a federal investigator, such as position David and Christy used to have in the Southern District of New York. That may be a crime if you're under oath in front of Congress. And he's making it clear that you want to tell lies to the American public and to the press. That's one thing. You want to tell lies on the ellipse. That's one thing. That is not what's being charged here. And so I think that is really smart to make it very clear, because one of the things, this is really following up on David's excellent point, which is one of the reasons you do a speaking indictment, and particularly in a case there's no case that's going to get more attention, is there is an educational function here to those people who are willing to listen. And that, obviously there's some who are just not going to think this is worth the paper it's printed on, but those people willing to listen, who will read it, it is really important to do that. Having been in the special counsel Mueller investigation, one of the really wonderful things was seeing the judges understand that educational function and the unique moment that they have to help people understand the criminal law and why people are before them and what rights they have and why they're being held accountable.
I want to keep our entire panel here. We've got 3 experienced federal prosecutors now that the federal prosecution team run by Jack Smith has indicted Donald Trump for an attempted coup, for efforts to overthrow the election. I also want to give a little bit of a reset on what we're doing right now. I'm going to show everyone the room again where we're waiting Jack Smith to speak tonight. We're told that any minute Special Counsel Smith will come out to that podium and speak for only the second time in this entire probe. Unlike certain legal activities where you think you've heard leaks or quotes or interviews with prosecutors. The prosecutor in Georgia has done interviews, for example. We haven't had a single interview with Jack Smith anywhere in the world in any medium, and this will be only his second ever remarks. So you can bet that Donald Trump, the defendant, and everyone in America that is following this will want to hear what Special Counsel Smith has to say. We're going to bring you that here on Msnbc any moment. The second thing I want to tell you is what we're going to do here during this hour of breaking coverage on the beat. This indictment just actually came out within the last half hour. So if you made your way to the news, to your news show here because you heard about it or you just watch the news regularly, this is truly a breaking news moment. We're going to experience it together. And I can tell you while I'm talking to you through the camera, I have lawyers in all corners of this set going through every page of it. What I will tell you overall is we're going to try to break this up and make it clear so we learn tonight what's in here. We've been waiting for this for a long time. And so as an overview, I'll tell you that the conspiracy here is broader than just January 6th. In a moment, I'm going to read from the indictment itself. But just to give viewers the overview as we've been processing this, you can think of four big conspiracy allegations that the Justice Department is making tonight against Donald Trump. Number one, that in 7 different states, they committed a type of fraud with those fake or fraudulent electors that we've heard about. That they tried to basically hijack the election process with a kind of a coup or an abuse of government power at the Justice Department. That's why there's so many co-conspirators listed. One of them was an actual DOJ official at the time. Third, something the January 6th committee really shined a light on, Donald Trump's efforts repeatedly to get the vice president to do something that the DOJ says was illegal, which is try to steal the election. And then fourth, with regard to the horrific violence that everyone remembers on that day, Jack Smith puts it very precisely here. He does not say that Donald Trump was the sole cause of that violence, or in law, what they sometimes call the but-for cause. Doesn't set it at that level, but he does say, new tonight in this indictment, that Trump and his co-conspirators tried to, quote, exploit the violence that did occur that day by people that Trump did summon to Washington in an ongoing effort to continue to try to illegally overthrow the election, even as that violence occurred and, according to many, got out of control. So that's different than, say, incitement or an insurrection. It is a different set of language. We're going to hear from our lawyers as we break that down. So those are just some of the new allegations in this conspiracy indictment. I also want to state, and you'll hear this repeatedly, that Donald Trump is a defendant. He has rights and he is legally presumed innocent in the American system and court of law. Now, reading from the indictment, and then we're going to bring our lawyers back in, it states that Trump pursued, quote, unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results, and goes on to state that Trump sought to enlist, as I mentioned, the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification to, quote, fraudulently alter the election results. Bringing in Christy Greenberg, when you look at some of those details, as I mentioned, not all of them involve the violence of January 6th. Some of what is now newly put down in writing here, efforts to lobby or issue illegal orders to the vice president, Smith is saying that would have been an illegal plot even if no one had stormed the Capitol.
Right. I think this indictment, I mean, he's in his Taylor Swift Speak Now era, Jack Smith. This is a speaking indictment. 45 pages of just incredible detail where he goes through what I think is really important, that count 4 especially, which was a bit of a wild card, the conspiracy against the right to vote. And the fact that in order to prove up that charge, there needs to be a specific intent to deprive someone of that protected right to vote. And that just seems at the heart of this whole indictment, this idea that you are depriving the democratic process of working the way that it should. And so that's something that I think every American who goes and to cast their vote for any election can really relate to and look at this and say, hey, this affects me. This isn't just about any event that dealt with violence. This is about every person having their right to have their votes counted.
And we're getting the notice, David, that Jack Smith really will be coming on any moment. I have to reserve the right to cut in on any guest if he does. But your response to what Christy said and the point that I'm raising, that, again, here we are looking at where we expect Smith to come out any moment and speak on the new indictment of Donald Trump tonight. But the fact that much of this speaking indictment speaks about illegal activities separate from the violence on the 6th.
Yeah, and I think just to build on her point, focusing on the book, but this really goes into some detail as it goes through each of the major contested battleground states and what efforts were taken there. And we talked a couple of weeks ago on the show about how in the case Michigan brought the case against their fraudulent electors, and so this really goes it goes well out beyond the steps of the Capitol out to each of these states and talks about how these efforts were to undermine the democratic processes in those states, and that he had specific intent to do that, to deprive those people of their votes, not just kind of in a kind of an intangible way, but when you look at how he's laid this out state by state, act by act, at each one of those states, it really brings it home, so to speak.
Yeah, and Andrew, I want to read from page 37, which has really damning allegations about the lengths they went to submit these fraudulent electors. There's some, Andrew, on the president's team and his allies who tried to say, look, fans will be fans, and they held meetings, who cares? A kind of real minimization. I'm just watching our cameras moving. I don't have eyes on Smith yet. We're watching the door where he may come out, and you can just see that room is, you probably hear a pin drop in there. Andrew, you've been in preparation for these kind of press conferences as well. We're watching Special Counsel Jack Smith approach the podium. Let's listen as he speaks on this date of the second federal indictment of Donald Trump.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021 was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots, and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other co-conspirators?
Brief remarks there from Special Counsel Jack Smith on the first ever indictment of a former president for trying to steal an election. Donald Trump now indicted in the January 6th probe along with 6 co-conspirators. This is MSNBC's breaking coverage for you. We are going to get reaction from our legal experts. I want to bring in for the first time in this hour former acting U.S. Solicitor General, DOJ veteran, Neil Katyal. Neil, it is official now in a way that it wasn't an hour ago or even the day of the target letter. And so with that in mind, I'd like your response, one, to what we just heard from Special Counsel Smith, and two, quite seriously what tonight means for legal history and democracy in America.
Ari, the gravity of this moment cannot be overstated. I mean, it is just unbelievable what we just saw with Jack Smith. You saw a career prosecutor, someone charged with enforcing the law, say the former president of the United States and the current leading presidential candidate for one of the parties is charged for his role in trying to upend a free and fair election. This is certainly the biggest legal case in our lifetimes. It is one of the biggest cases ever in the history of the United States. It is up there with Dred Scott. It is up there with Brown versus Board of Education because it goes to who we are as a people. And Jack Smith today did something to restore confidence in the rule of law in unimaginable ways. And you heard him speak in such a measured way, emphasizing Donald Trump's presumption of innocence, that this evidence all has to be tested in a court of law. I expect Donald Trump to continue speaking in exactly the opposite way, demonizing Jack Smith, calling him deranged, calling it the Biden prosecution. But I think all of our viewers should understand, Jack Smith was not appointed by President Biden. He was picked as an independent career prosecutor, and he's operating under special counsel guidelines that give him full independence to conduct this investigation in the way he wants to and charge who he thinks is warranted. So when you hear the attack on the Biden Justice Department going after Donald Trump, that is poppycock. This is an independent career prosecutor bringing some of the most grave charges imaginable because of what happened on January 6th. So I think Jack Smith has met the moment, and now it is up to this criminal trial to proceed with a very, very good judge, with Judge Chutkan, fair to both sides. And if Donald Trump is so convinced he's innocent, bring it on, put on your defense in a court of law, and let's see how it fares.
Neil Kochel, stay with me, part of our breaking coverage here, as well as our team in the newsroom. Same question to you, Andrew Weissman, because sometimes covering these stories can be like the Weather Channel when the storm is days away. By the time the storm gets here, everyone's moving on to the next thing. I want to make sure we absorb here with our experts and our DOJ veterans what this means now that it's official and what you thought of what we just heard from Special Counsel Smith.
So it's great that you started there, because I do think that what happens a lot of times is we get anesthetized to what has happened, and especially with Donald Trump, because there's so many things that he does where you forget to step back and think about the enormity of the situation we're in. We are about to see it's a historic ordeal that this country is going to go through because of choices that Donald Trump made. I think that as a prosecutor, I think that Jack Smith correctly, and you can see it in the indictment, really focused on the line. That you have a former president who, in order to stay in power, lied in just numerous ways to try and stay in power. I know you wanted to focus on some specifics, and I do think that the specifics sort of goes to your larger point. And one of the things I was struck by in terms of the pressure, not just to a Department of Justice that we worked in, and it's very hard to read this and see what was being done to the Justice Department and what clearly Jeff Clark was willing to do in order to fabricate a fraud investigation to keep the former president in office. But the pressure on Mike Pence, it's very clear that Mike Pence gave clear testimony in the grand jury. It looks very clear that Mark Meadows did.
Yeah, let me slow you down, and we got to let you continue, but just slow down the key points.
Sure.
That some of the damning material from what we now have, that we didn't have this morning, is that the vice president at the time, now former Vice President Pence, has cooperated at least to the degree that he handed over the contemporaneous notes, which show what he said at the time. Lawyers find that very probative. And he provided actual testimony, and then we're going to do it together. I'm curious because I think viewers will be able to tell this is breaking, so we can't coordinate. I'm on page 37. What page are you on?
I'm on page 36.
36?
So
So you go first.
Okay, great. It's perfect. So on page 36 in paragraph 97, this is part of the effort of the former president, Donald Trump, with his vice president telling him that he has the authority to do something that the vice president is repeatedly saying he doesn't. This is on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the vice president. When the vice president refused to agree to the defendant's request that he obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the vice president that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him. Upon learning of this, the vice president's chief of staff, that's Mark Meadows, was concerned for the vice president's safety and alerted the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail. Just step back. This goes to really the specific and then the general point. The allegation here is that the president of the United States was going to take a step with respect to his own vice president that caused such concern that the chief of staff, his own chief of staff, was alerting the Secret Service to violence that would come to the vice president of the United States because of the conduct of the president of the United States.
And that was, to your point, proven to be not only not alarmist, but prescient, given the gallows that were erected, the Secret Service clash, hang Mike Pence, agents, according to the January 6th committee, getting this evidence that nobody initially knew, even on the 7th, given how bad it looked, that agents were calling, saying goodbye to family members. And so you view Smith as telling a jury what with this? We're on page 36, paragraph 97.
This is just one of the many lies that, as David pointed out, this is sort of a masterpiece in terms of a narrative, and yet it's a tragedy in terms of what it tells about this country. But this is talking about allegations, just to be clear, it still has to be proved, but allegations against the former president of repeated lies, even where it could lead to violence against his own vice president, such that, it's just remarkable to me that if you have Mark Meadows, who to me this reads also, that Mark Meadows, there's a reason I think he is not one of the co-conspirators when you look at this. To me, it suggests that he has definitely cooperated, because when you read just that paragraph, to me it reads like that's where they got some of this information.
Well, and you've gotten people to cooperate in the past, so that's interesting coming from you as legal analysis. It also speaks to the strength of this indictment and how detailed it is, that Smith doesn't just have all the public's terrible stuff people know, but all this inside information. I have a follow-up for you as we turn to page 37, and Neil Koch, I want to bring you in on the same question, because this is something we discussed when we covered the Jan 6 hearings and other things, and people ask, is it going to lead to anything? Well, tonight, it led to this indictment of Donald Trump for a coup-related set of conspiracies. On page 37, again, we're reading this on Msnbc for the first time because we've just been making our way through it. The language is very interesting. We're talking about a conspiracy that Jack Smith says was hatched inside the White House at the highest levels of our government. And it says, quote, an agent of the defendant. It's always a bad sign when the outgoing president is described this way in an indictment, but quote, an agent of the defendant contacted a senator to ask him to deliver documents to the vice president. The agent then facilitated receipt of the, quote, fraudulent certificates signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin. And this was, as you know, Andrew, the effort and the plot and the now indicted plot went this far, deep into the day of the 6th, after what you just described as what they perceived as a safety issue, a threat to the vice president. Now they're trying to get the fraud in his hands, trying to push it forward. This is paragraph 101. What's striking to me and what your analysis is, it seems like Smith's prosecutors are saying here, what you did as an agent of this conspiracy in concert with them and other people went way beyond your lawful power.
Absolutely. And I think paragraph 99 to me has always been something that I think is, as looking at this as a prosecutor, is something that is, I think, going to be readily provable and is really hard for the former president to counteract. And that is where, after being told repeatedly by the vice president that he is not going to disobey his oath of office and overthrow the will of the people. On January 5th, the President of the United States issues a statement saying the Vice President agrees with me that he does not have to go forward. And that is something that is alleged here to be absolutely 100% false.
Yeah.
And that is going to be a hard thing at trial for Donald Trump to ever counteract. And the real question for a jury is going to be, why would he do that? And if you want to get into somebody's state of mind and did they intentionally do something, this is a clear lie. And just think about what it meant that it was on January 5th, just before the January 6th insurrection.
Andrew Weissman's walking us through this. I want to bring in David, but more news coming out of the Justice Department. We are now being told here in our newsroom that Attorney General Garland will be speaking momentarily. We heard from Jack Smith moments ago on the new Trump indictment, the first ever coup and election conspiracy indictment of a former president. Special Counsel Smith has a type of independence in his role, but he does work within the Attorney General's Justice Department. Now we're told any moment, certainly within the hour, according to the guidance we have, the Attorney General will come out and speak. So we will be bringing that to viewers as soon as we get eyes on the Attorney General. We'll go as early as we can, same way we did with the special counsel here on a night where we're dealing with the indictment of Donald Trump for efforts to steal the election. I have Neil Kochel on deck, but David wanted to get in. Go ahead.
I just was going to build on Andrew's point. You know, in paragraph 99, where the president comes out and says that he and the vice president are in total agreement, knowing that they're not, knowing that his position is wrong, it is not just another lie, but it also really speaks to his recklessness and the dangerousness of his lies.
And looking at that, I want to read to Neil for something else we want to get into. I've told viewers we're going to be going through this piece by piece. It is a quite lengthy speaking indictment. Smith alleges that on January 6th, Trump made these false statements integral to criminal plans to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' right to vote and have their votes counted. That Trump repeated the false claims of election fraud, gave this, quote, false hope that the vice president might change the election outcome, as we've been discussing, and directed the crowd to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. Neil Kochel, building on what I mentioned I was going to ask you about, which is how the campaign and allegedly illegal campaign against Vice President Pence was carried out, is linked in this way to the crowd, not at the level of an insurrection, and yet at the same time, not as if it didn't matter at all. Smith is making the argument for the first time tonight, and he's got to prove it to a jury, that the violence was used, exploited by then outgoing President Trump.
Yeah, he's making that as part of the argument. So the big picture here, Ari, is that Jack Smith has to prove two things, as every federal prosecutor does to put someone in jail. You have to have a bad act, an actus reus, and a bad mens rea, a bad criminal intent. And so when Andrew Weissman talks about the January 5th Pence stuff, or when you talk about the fake electors and the plot in the 7 states to throw out the popular vote and just replace them with fake electors that state legislatures, dreamed up, that all goes to the bad act, the actus reus, because that's what conspiracy requires, an agreement to do something that is illegal. Trump's defense has always been more on the mens rea side. I legitimately thought I won the election, and so I didn't have a bad criminal intent. I was safeguarding American democracy. And that's where the other part of the detail in this indictment becomes so significant, both the part that you just flashed on the screen, as well as page after page of people going and saying to Donald Trump, you didn't win this thing. There's no way you won this thing. And the picture that's painted is you'd have to be literally insane to think you won the election after everyone, including the intelligence officials, the election security officials, and others are saying you didn't win. And so that's why you see both halves of this, both going to bad criminal intent and going to the bad criminal act.
Neil Kochel, thank you very much for making time for us on this breaking news night. We'll be hearing more from you tonight, and we're going to pick up the Attorney General, I'm told, speaking now.
Engaged in what has become the largest investigation in our history. In November last, I appointed Jack Smith, special counsel, to take on the ongoing investigation. in order to underline the department's commitment to accountability and independence. Mr. Smith and his team of experienced principled career agents and prosecutors have followed the facts and the law wherever they lead. Any questions about this matter will have to be answered by the filings made in the courtroom.
Thank you, everyone.
We've been listening to Attorney General Garland. We're going to try to keep our cameras for as long as we can. This is him making what was basically unscheduled remarks there on the move in Untold Philadelphia. Again, this breaking news, so we're just following it, and you're seeing what we're seeing. Our camera's live, just trying to keep an eye on the Attorney General and his retinue. But he's speaking here roughly about 25 minutes after Special Counsel Jack Smith gave what were only his second ever remarks in this investigation. And you heard the Attorney General say something that is standard, but that also reflects the very tight-lipped and very traditional approach this probe has taken, which is if you have questions, read the indictment. Actually, we've been doing that. Indeed, Andrew Weissman and I have been doing that since before the Attorney General recommended that. But basically, that's a fair set of instructions. There are counsels and others who've done it differently. Ken Starr, I mentioned, or the prosecutor in Georgia have been more public. But the Attorney General echoing what Special Counsel Smith said, read the indictment for the actions and the updates and the news here. And we have been going through that. I have some other parts we haven't gotten to yet. I want to bring in another one of our experts here on this breaking news night, former federal prosecutor, U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who's handled conspiracy against rights cases. First of all, good evening, Joyce.
Good night, Ari.
Yeah, good to have you. I want to start big picture and then read some quotes to you as we promised to do. But Andrew and I and Neil and Christy and David have all reflected this evening that